let's look at cancer, right? Because maybe the last thing, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Maybe the last thing that we want in cancer, uh, given that the cell converts to glycolysis, right? The mitochondria converts from oxidative phosphorylation to produce ATP. It uses uh, glycolysis or fermentation, right? Which is a process that stems from the impaired ability to efficiently use glucose for ATP production, and so glucose is upregulated massively in glycolytic conditions because it's a much faster way of producing energy by converting the glucose into lactate, right? And then the lactate is used to fuel as the substrate for the cancer cell's growth. And, even worse, it's metastasization, right? It's spread throughout the body. So, and that's a very fast process, right? So now you have a ramped up metabolism, which can even lead to cachexia, right? In certain cases, when it completely spins out of control. However, I'd love to hear your thoughts then on the idea that actually slowing down the metabolism and using a ketogenic diet to do so would be a better approach than optimizing the cells by giving it more energy in the form of glucose, even though for a healthy cell, the proposition that the bioenergetic view is making is that no, that would actually be the healthiest thing to do. Give me your thoughts on that.
So what I'm going to say will sound controversial, but actually isn't in the research, which actually, I mean, I think is the case with a lot of these principles. But saying that sugar feeds cancer is 25% true. And what I mean by that is we're missing the other part of that statement, which is that sugar, amino acids, fatty acids, and ketones feed cancer. And so what we essentially have is a state where cancer is incredibly metabolically deranged, as you said, and trying to gobble up as much fuel as it can and grow as fast as it can. And it will convert glucose to lactate, and it actually uses that structurally, that lactate's used structurally, as opposed to just as its only way of producing energy. Because while it's doing that, it's running the Krebs cycle and it's running the mitochondria using amino acids and using fatty acids and ketones if we provide them. So mitochondria or cancer cells are hungry and they'll use everything we give them, and they're incredibly deranged. And so with that in mind, there's a couple of important pieces here. One is the idea that any fuel is going to produce cancer, I think, is missing the point, because cancer likes all these fuels. And if it was as simple as providing them causes cancer, then we would all have cancer just from existing, right? There's always fuel. Uh, the other piece there is the recognition of what is actually getting deranged in the cancer cell's metabolism. That I think that's where we want to put our focus, as opposed to just trying to starve it out by reducing the things that feed it. So is it true that lowering fuel availability, just overall in the blood, less fatty acids, less glucose, less amino acids would help to starve cancer out? Yes, hypothetically it should slow its growth, although it is of course also coming at a cost to our bodies otherwise, which most things that are trying to remove cancer, stop its growth, kill it, do that too, right? The idea is generally, let's kill the cancer, and we're going to hurt ourselves, but we can survive it. And from that approach, yeah, reducing the availability of fuel is one way to do it and can be potentially effective. But I think if we can work toward trying to reverse the metabolic derangement in the first place, that would be my goal. Obviously, it gets really complicated when we've gotten to a point where we're already manifesting in some significant form of cancer. And at that point, we're throwing band-aids on, as opposed to something decades earlier that maybe we could help to prevent the process from occurring, or getting anywhere near that far. So what I would say, the real thing we want to in most cases, what we want to focus on is the prevention of that derangement. When it already gets to that place, we will probably have to do things that come at a cost. And ketogenic diet, I think, could be part of that. As you were saying, that it depends on the type of cancer. And it's worth noting as well, you mentioned metastasizing or metastasis, and that in a lot of states is associated with an increased rate of free fatty acid utilization and increased rates of autophagy and things like that that we're trying to mimic and trying to encourage on a low carb diet. So we want to be careful just with this blanket assumption here. And I do think it's getting it borderline, is irresponsible to just say this is a sugar problem. So that's just a couple of points that I'll consider. Go ahead.
No, you're making great points. Again, when I ran into that study that my particular cancer used the autophagic process to supply substrate, I stopped all the fasting I was doing because I realized at that moment that, wait a second, I've been doing not only intermittent fasting, but I got to a point where I was doing like, 40, I was doing 2 48-hour fasts every week, right? So I was doing like, I was getting into like, so I had the cancer 8 years ago that took my kidney. The cancer came back almost 2 years ago in my liver, and we took a chunk of my liver out. And I was fasting, trying to deal with that, right? And when I read that study, I was like, wait a second, fasting generates, ramps up, accelerates the autophagic process. So I stopped all fasting. And so the points you're making are correct. And if you cut off glucose, by the way, if you cut off carbohydrates, no problem. The cancer will just upregulate gluconeogenesis, and
Right.
it'll get all the glucose it needs from amino acids. So you're exactly correct. Certainly, mitigating cancer and prevention is the best way to deal with it. But once you've got it, you're right. The prevalent idea is to kill the cancer without killing you. And who's going to survive, right? Who's going to outlive? Because the cancer will live if you take it out, right? You can keep it in a petri dish alive forever, but you won't live forever. So who's going to outlast who? That's the question. Since we're on the ketogenic diet as one way of dealing with or managing cancer, because you might end up giving yourself you might go on a high fat ketogenic diet, and without doing the research, unwittingly fuel the cancer, because there are cancers that actually prefer, right, fatty acid metabolism to glucose metabolism, and then you're screwing yourself there. So considering the numerous benefits associated with the ketogenic diet, right, that lots of studies, lots of narrative, lots of influencers. I mean, it's hard to sort out what's right and what's not, but certainly there are studies, right? Effective weight loss, improved metabolic health, enhanced brain function, increased energy and focus, lack of the ever-present hunger that you have when you're eating a high carb diet. So those are some of the advantages that people will tout about the ketogenic diet. And I will also have to admit that when I was on a high fat ketogenic diet in the beginning of my cancer journey, and I was on that for a while, my brain was firing like it never had before. I mean, it was unbelievable. Now that could be because I was coming off like a complete, like, just I ate a lot of carbs and fats and protein to excess gluttonous, right? Like, so it just might have been that, having thrown all of that out, that my brain was operating the way it should, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, it was clear that ketones were doing something that some would say are magical, but certainly were an enhancement. So reconcile these advantages with your view that carbohydrates are a superior source of fuel, and that low carb let's just say ketogenic diets could actually be detrimental to health.
Mhm. Yeah, and as you're pointing out, it is, I would say, mixed bag, right? There are some clear benefits, not even outcome wise, but mechanistically, that I think are responsible for those outcomes. Yet at the same time, I think there are negatives that also come with and come at a long term cost. And I think we can get the benefits without that cost. And just real briefly to come back to the cancer side,
Mhm.
just wanted to mention there are, of course, in our case or in your case, a very rare form that we're dealing with, but some of the more common ones like different forms of breast cancer and prostate
Mhm.
cancer and pancreatic cancer, things like that. There are there are a number of different ones where fatty acids fuel the growth, and increased fatty acid oxidation is a very clear indicator and can actually increase metastasis and things like that. So
Right,
it's not like just this one really rare one glucose
right,
restriction wasn't the answer. This is large. I don't want to say fully universal, but a pretty, yeah, relatively universal presentation, or at least a piece of it, that's seen very clearly. And you also see chronic stress in cancer, often with lipolysis and ketogenesis and gluconeogenesis. You mentioned not wanting to produce or not wanting to use amino acids to produce the glucose, which our bodies will do when, or cancer cells will signal for. And
mhm,
that is a huge part that drives the cachexia that you were mentioning too, as a feature there. And so with that in mind, I think if there were different ways that we could starve or kill the cancer, I'd probably like to do it without restricting our nutrition, right? Making sure we're providing enough fuel for ourselves so that we can get through that,
mhm,
knowing that the cancer is going to get it anyway, and we want to prevent something like cachexia for sure, which is a
right.
huge problem. So
When you talk about giving something counterintuitively, when you talk about just restricting the fuel, one of the big things about prostate cancer is that the fuel for prostate cancer is testosterone, right? I mean, they say, right, the hormone is feeding the cancer. And so one of the things that they do is that they cut off your testosterone, they chemically castrate you in order to slow the growth of the cancer. Uh, and the interesting thing is there are studies that are showing that super high amounts of testosterone are actually being shown to be effective in reducing the size of the tumor and managing the cancer, which is completely counterintuitive. And then I'm wondering, wait a second. So if what if you what if you go on a high carb diet? Is it counterintuitive that actually that might be better for you?
yeah, yeah. Well, and
I-
another, so I mean, a couple other things. I think estrogen not only is a large player in prostate cancer, or even precursors like prostatitis and enlargement, but also in most cancers as one of the main growth hormones, estrogen and stress hormones. So I think there's a piece of that there. And of course, testosterone can aromatize. And so that can potentially be maybe by reducing the testosterone helps, but maybe it's not as much of the.
So you're thinking it might be right. You're thinking it might be the estrogen. I know they found that men with low testosterone were actually more susceptible to prostate cancer because of what you're suggesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think estrogen is a culprit in a lot of them. And the other thing you see too is, speaking of the metabolic derangement you see it's typically the opposite of what happens in a person who is effectively using carbohydrates. For example, the NAD to NADH ratio that we were talking about is one of the clearest representations of our metabolism, right? When that is high, we have a good metabolism. When it's low, we don't. And in every degenerative state, you see a lower NAD to NADH ratio, and that
Mm.
includes cancer. And the when we're looking at the nutrient differences, carbohydrates are the ones that increase that NAD to NADH ratio significantly relative to fats.